next is our second keynote and our last session for this morning, giving us the entrepreneur's view of navigating financial and development challenges. Please welcome from Ipsen, Marc de Garidel.
All right, so it seems that people are more interested in lunch than in presentations. So I want to thank obviously Pierre and the HTID team to have invited me. And although the title is very fancy, I should have probably renamed the title of this presentation as an entrepreneur. How do you lose all your hair as a professional? So I'll give some clarity on that. So we live in the biotech field, extraordinary moments. I don't know if you had a chance to see some of the ESMO results in the last few days for cancer, but there were some notable improvements in the cancer care for the future, thanks to some of the news we heard this weekend. But we should be reminded that getting there is not easy. You know the statistics in drug development. Out of 10 drugs that enter the clinic, only one is going to make it to the market. It's not finished. Once it's on the market, there is one blockbuster, 3 or 4 products recover their cost, and then 5 of them basically do not recover investments. So we live in a very risky and difficult world, and as an entrepreneur, part of the responsibility you have, associated obviously with the investors, is to find a way to get to the end game, and especially to treat patients. So what I'm going to do today is just give you a quick background about the things I've done, because I think it will obviously influence some of my recommendations. I want to give entrepreneurs the lessons of what you should do, what you should not do. Then, because of my background, having done a number of transactions over the last few years, think about how you should proceed if you want to do an exit, and then finally some concluding remarks. So first, I was very lucky in my career to be exposed to essentially the key elements of success in the industry, and I joined Eli Lilly primarily in the US for a number of years. So I really learned by watching essentially what success could be, but also what failure could be. And then in your career, you need to be lucky, and I was lucky. So in the mid-90s, I was offered to be the CFO of Amgen Europe. And at that time, the CEO came to me and said, Mark, we are hiring you for actually a 3-year project. We have no operations in Europe, but we are going to launch probably between 2018 and 21, 3 or 4 drugs. Some of them could really potentially very meaningful treatments. So your role is to figure out what is the best way to distribute and to construct a fiscal legal setup in Europe that would be the most cost efficient. And please don't look at big pharma. So this was the spirit of Amgen in those days. So what we did with a number of people, we essentially in 3 years built up what is considered today the reference for all biotech. So if you look at any biotech that comes to Europe to operate, this is really what we did, a work of 3 years. A couple of years later, the same CEO said, Mark, we want you to launch, those three drugs in France. And technically speaking, he had very little marketing, and sales experience. So again, I was lucky to be with a bunch of fantastic people around me, and we did the best launch ever at the time of any drug in France. And we were in competition, by the way, against J&J and Roche. So people were really stunned at what we had done. But what we had done was, again, looking at the future. We didn't build a huge infrastructure with sales rep. what we did in the background, we did a strong preparation of the launch with the doctors, medical affairs, and we obviously spent an inordinate amount of time with reimbursement, which we know France was not an easy thing. So then I moved on to Ipsen as a first-time CEO. And then actually I met the Evercore team, François, who, when I joined, told me, Mark, what the hell are you doing? Why are you joining Ipsen? There is no chance this company will be around in the next 10 years. And I said, well, yeah, maybe, so we'll see. But, we're going to try to figure it out. And at Ipsen, I learned a theme that you're going to hear me again and again, that focus and speed are two ingredients of success. And they need to go together. They are not separate. Because if you go fast and you crash, it doesn't help. Focus is great, but if you are too slow, again, we live in a very competitive world, and you're not going to win. So ultimately, again, Ipsen, went over time. We tripled sales, we multiplied EBITDA by 6, and basically our market cap was multiplied by 6 too. So the Ipsen that was so thought to be in a graveyard actually resurrected, thanks again to some fantastic work of the team. And then after that, I was very tired, and I decided to take a break, thinking what I do next. And then luck again struck. I was in the US at the time, and then, I went into the biotech to essentially, develop phase 2 biotechs. And Sofinova was actually a corner investor in that process. And we led, in 5 years, 2 transactions in the cardiovascular space, where everybody told me when I joined those companies, never go into cardiovascular. There is no market. No one wants to develop a drug in cardiovascular. Again, 5 years later, cardiovascular is, still hot. And by the way, when you look at the field of obesity, which is a sort of a bigger area, you see today the market cap, 2 biggest market cap are with Lilly and Novo Nordisk, which are pretty much in that space. So it just shows, don't follow always the crowd. Think about what you're doing, and as long as you have a good asset, you're going to be fine. And then my last experiment is at Abivax. Again, we saw this morning that in France, unfortunately, the market cap of companies relative to the other market is not good. But if you look at least, the good news for me as a CEO of Abivax, we are the #1 market cap in France. And yet, you look at the history of Abivax. Abivax was, again, created in 2013, listed on a stock exchange, Euronext, in 2015, for HIV. HIV didn't work. Drug was repurposed to IBD. At the end of, in 21, we had a fantastic phase 2 results. And yet, nearly 2 years later, the company was close to bankruptcy. The CFO tells me 3 hours away from bankruptcy. So how do you go from a very successful phase 2 to nearly bankruptcy? So we'll talk about that. But the good news is a year later, we did, we were in the top 4 in the world to raise 500 million euros during 2023, one of the worst years for raising money. And we did the biggest IPO in the history of biotech in France. So it shows biotech, it goes up, it goes down, and you just have to fasten your seatbelt. So what are the lessons and the things you should, really reflect upon when you invest or when you run a biotech company? And these are really 3 pillars I have always used in my choice of companies. So I look at 3 things. So 1, you need to look at whether the science which is being developed will ultimately be applicable to patients. Some companies are great at science, but what they do next is a disaster. So you need to be driven by patients. Ultimately, that's how you measure your success. So that's the first pillar. The second thing, which in France is, in my mind, an issue, is you really need to look at the governance, which means basically the board of directors, and also the investors. Attracting top investors is a pain in the somewhere, but the value they add is just incredible. And thirdly, as you know, in execution, it's all about people. If you have great people around you, you'll do wonders. If you have people who are not competent or who don't work with each other, you're going to fail. So you need to think about that. So I'm going to insist primarily more on the first dimension. And that list that you have on this slide is absolutely not exhaustive. For example, I omitted IP. IP protection is the key of drug development. I didn't detail CMC. By the way, CMC, I was in a forum actually 2 weeks ago in Italy, and the head of Merck, essentially the CBO of Merck, said 40% of the target companies they would like to buy do not happen, because when they look at the CMC filing of those biotechs, they are just not ready. So, and I won't talk about that. But what I want to talk about are things that obviously are a bit closer to where I personally contributed, given the prior background I gave you. And it's my really obsession. When you develop a drug, it's all about differentiation in the end. And the differentiation, the good news, is you have several levers, right? The first one is efficacy. The second one is safety. But when you develop a drug, you need to look at competition. You need to look at what is a standard of care. And in the world of this new decade, even in the US, it's not only the question of getting your drug registered, but the major challenge actually is the reimbursement. So you need to start designing your studies already in phase 2. And I can give a couple of examples, actually a bit later, when I go to the what not to do, and some comparison with other companies, where the decision you make in terms of differentiation will again influence greatly the fate of the company. So if there is at least one word you should leave before lunch, is differentiation for the drug. I see many biotechs that are basically developing sort of me-toos. And you wonder why they don't get finance, because nobody cares about me-toos anymore. Because ultimately, the value creation for patient is only if the drug is registered and the drug is well reimbursed. So these are some of the key considerations. Then I would say, again, on terms of board of directors and investors, I made the comment, you should seek really the best investors. I know it's hard. They are hard. They're going to hit you on the valuation of the company, initially. But, they become really key in the value creation process. They have their network. They can help you as an entrepreneur like no one can. So it's hard, but you're going to learn a lot, and you're going to create much more value. But on the board of directors, we see many companies bringing their friends, CEOs bringing their friends on the board. And I can tell you, this is a big mistake. This is a waste of money. You think you're going to be happy. What you want to have a strong board of directors. As a CEO, you want people to challenge you, to tell you, well, why are you not going there? Why are you doing this? Yes, it's not necessarily pleasant, but this is a way, again, to reduce risk for, again, this very complex process. And finally, developing a drug is, small things can derail a program. So you need to try to have in-house or through external, collaboration, the best experts in each field. Regulatory experts, they are critical. CMC experts, critical. Quality, if your phase 2 or your program is ongoing, if you don't look at the blinded data on a regular basis, and some centers start to do stupid things, you want to catch them before they ruin your study. So these are examples of bringing best talents, and if you cannot do it, in-house, at least collaborate with the best, because that's the recipe for success. So now, what you should not do. And so the first conception is diversification is wonderful. But I can tell you, again, Corvidia and Syncor were primarily sold on a single asset. And why we were successful is because when you are too diversified, which, by the way, you see in big pharma, is you spend your time on too many things, and you are not intense enough on what counts. So I would highly recommend you start with one, you develop your drug in one indication, and then you move to the next one. But don't have 4 programs in parallel in multiple things. I think it's a recipe for failure. The second thing also I learned, and that's part again of the role of a CEO, raise enough money so that your trials are well designed and you get the answer you want. And I give you here, again, a very concrete example. At Syncor, we are developing, sort of a new generation of anti-hypertensive, a new mechanism of action. And we were in competition with another company called Mineralis. For the phase 2, what we decided to do, we did 4 phase 2s to try to figure out where the drug works. Our competitor did only 1. What happened is we got fantastic results in 3 indications, 1 failed. The other had sort of mixed results. We got bought by AZ, which, by the way, wanted to potentially buy the 2 companies. But AZ told us, you answer the question we want, because now in phase 2, you de-risk the asset, and we know exactly what to do in phase 3. So make sure that you raise the right amount of capital to do the right studies. Then, as you know, when you are a scientist, you obviously, you want to succeed. And part of it is obviously resilience is very important. But at some point, you need to stop. And, it's an art. You learn it over time. In some cases, it's great to continue. But in many instances, it's also good to fail. And I have the recollection when I was CEO of Ipsen, when our drug failed, actually stock went up. And I went to the analyst and I said, how come? This is bad news. It should have come down. They said, yeah, but you're one of the few CEOs who know how to stop drugs, because we see so many CEOs around that keep going on and bring nothing. And then that's also a comment for European investors. They are going to tackle you with dilution, and you have to fight against dilution, because at the end of the day, what counts is to make the pie as big as possible, and the dilution is not a good idea, because having a large proportion of a small pie is not actually good compared to having a small proportion of a huge pie. So in terms of exits, what are the advice? The first one, as a CEO, don't think about the exit. Do a good job, develop a drug as if you were going to launch it, because otherwise you start to cut corners and you do stupid things. So it's extremely important that as CEO, exit selling is not, should not be your primary strategy. And we see again examples of companies that are essentially built to sell, and then they disappear because they didn't sell. The other advice I give you is when you do your drug development, it's always good to speak to big pharma about what you're doing, and not again with the intent to sell. Just try to get feedback. Then you start to know them, and this is how you build the relationship. And then an example that applies to Abivax. After the end of phase 2, Abivax should have risen a large amount of capital on the good news. Yes, there is dilution for investors initially, but it would have allowed the company to quickly start the phase 3 and not to lose substantial amount of valuation over time and raise when later there was no cash. And then finally, in deals, when things are progressing, my advice, it needs to be CEO to CEO, because otherwise, especially in big pharma, you have a lot of layers and you have a lot of people who are going to want to not to do the deal. So at the end of the day, it's the top guy, the CEO of the company that needs to be in direct touch. And I was lucky, to work with Pascal Sorio and then also with Lars at Novo to lead those deals. So just to conclude, we live really exciting times in the biotech industry. Again, the speed of innovation is tremendous, and there is plenty to do for offering better treatments to patients. But you need to make sure that the drug you develop is again well differentiated. If not, think twice. I see myself as a conductor of an orchestra. I'm not the guy who knows everything about developing drugs. Obviously a few things now, but you need to really rely on top-notch people around you and people who are going to tell you also the truth. Because when you are at the top, there are categories of employees who are scared to tell you the truth. But knowing the truth is much more important, because in the end, that's how you succeed. Combination of quality and speed, so focus, that's, I think, the winning game. And ultimately, don't forget the US market. That's, the largest market in the world. For IBD, where I operate, 70% of the market in the US. So if Abivax wants to survive, it needs to develop, for the US market. And this trend is unfortunately accelerating. The US is financing basically most of the research of the world. So don't forget it. Thank you very much, and have a great lunch.